Hey everyone, welcome to the Hour of History podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Bauman, and this week I'm talking to Dr. Matt Sutton, professor at Washington State University and the author of the recent book, Double Crossed: The Missionaries Who Spied for the United States During the Second World War. It's coming out late September 2019, published by Basic, and it promises to be a book that shares incredible stories about missionaries who decided to help the United States win World War II. It's a fascinating story for anyone who's interested in American religious history, American foreign policy, foreign relations, or just a good story. We talk about the book throughout. We talk about how historians are asking the right questions. It's a fascinating conversation, and I'm so glad to have you with us. As always, head over to hourofhistory.com for the episode write-up, links, and more information. hourofhistory.com/rex for more recommendations and a whole lot more content over there at hourofhistory.com. Thank you so much for listening on Hour of History. It's our world, anytime, any place. Enjoy.
You're listening to the Hour of History podcast.
Our world.
Anytime, any place.
For show notes, links, and more, be sure to visit our website at www.hourofhistory.com. And for all the book recommendations made during the podcast, head over to hourofhistory.com/rex. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. Without further delay, your Hour of History starts right now.
So, Dr. Matthew Sutton, it's such a pleasure to have you here. I'm very excited about your upcoming book, Double Crossed: The Missionaries Who Spied for the United States During the Second World War. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So this is, a very captivating title. Everyone who I've said, as I'm talking to people who I'm going to talk about Hour of History this week, everyone says, wow, that sounds interesting. So how did you come across such an interesting topic for a book?
Yeah, really, even I'm fascinated by it. I've read a bunch of spy thrillers over the last couple of years as I was working on this book, just because I got so interested in the topic myself, not just in terms of my own research, but just thinking about what it means to be a spy and to serve your nation in that way by lying and deceiving other people. But yeah, how I got into it was kind of interesting. I came at this as a historian of religion more than a historian of foreign policy. And I think a lot of times historians of foreign policy don't really see religion as clearly as they might, even if it's kind of right in front of them. And what I realized was that at least one missionary had served as a spy during World War II, and that was John Birch, who's famous because of the John Birch Society, which was named after him, although he had nothing to do with the John Birch Society. Mm-hmm. But that got me thinking that if John Birch was serving as a spy, as an intelligence agent during World War II, then there might have been others. And so I just started poking around from there and seeing what I could find.
And yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. And you mentioned and alluded there, you're a historian and you've worked on religion. What is your background in history?
Yeah, so my first book was on Aimee Semple McPherson, a revivalist in Los Angeles in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And she was a Pentecostal faith healer, very charismatic. And that was my dissertation in the first book. And then I wrote a second book on evangelicals and politics that covers roughly the last 150 years. And that came out in 2014. And this is my third sort of big book. I've done a few other smaller projects, but this was the third book that was based on serious original archival research.
And did it feel like you were, it must have taken sort of a leap of faith, if you'll excuse the pun, to move from evangelical history, which seems to be a really hot field that a lot of people are very interested in, and certainly your book was well received. Can you talk about that transition? Like you said, it started with an interest.
Yeah, part of it was intentional and strategic, just in thinking about the profession of history, that I had an advisor who was really good at encouraging me and her other students to think that each project should be a little bit more ambitious than the last one. And so the McPherson book focused, it was a microhistory, focused on one person in one, very particular place, Los Angeles in the 20s and 30s. Then the second book had a much wider cast of characters and a much larger time span. So with this one, it sort of made sense to move even beyond not just evangelicalism, but beyond Protestantism. I have Catholic characters in the book and one Jewish rabbi. and also it's international in scope. And so it is a challenge. And I had to read a lot on World War II, especially the kind of nuances. One of the things I did on purpose in the book was I used my characters to tell the story of World War II from every theater. And so one's based in London, one's based in Cairo, one's based in China, and then one's based in North Africa, in Palestine. And so the idea was that I had to really understand what was happening in the war from every angle, every direction. And that was the biggest challenge. And that wasn't something I had thought about when I jumped into the project. It was just something that happened as I began the research.
And it is interesting when we talk about World War II and sort of how we focus on it, where our vision is going to go temporally or geographically. There's so much to choose from, and you decide to look at these people who you have to go back and kind of get their backstory. So where does World War II begin for you?
Yeah, so I did want to give the backstory. So for me, it really begins with, with when each of them was born. I go back very briefly to, the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, because a couple of them were born abroad. They were missionary children in addition to becoming missionaries themselves. And that was part of what made them so attractive to American intelligence agencies, was they had such good language skills because they had grown up in other places. But the book itself focuses on the war, but with each character, I do kind of explain who they were and where they were before the war.
Did you find this sort of biographical approach to be helpful, or did you find it created more challenges along the way?
I thought it was fun. It wasn't what I pitched when I first put together the book proposal. I wanted to do a big book on religion in the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which is what becomes the CIA, and that's the main intelligence agency during World War II. But I had a really good editor, Dan Gersel at Basic Books, and he had suggested that rather than do this big kind of all-encompassing book about religion in the OSS, to focus on a few characters and to tell the story through their lives. And so then it became a matter of, first I liked the advice, I liked the suggestion. And then it was a matter of trying to figure out what characters would be best, who I could tell a full story about in a way that would be engaging and draw in an audience.
And these characters who you ended up finding in all corners of the world, London, China, Cairo, they had a deep connection with the culture and sort of a reliance on American dominance in a way. Can you explain a little bit how they got so spread out in the world, where this missionary impulse came from, and how they were able to sort of, spread out American missionaries?
Yeah, and I mean, each of them has a different reason for that, but they all were committed to spreading the Christian faith before the war, and then they all recognized with the war that if Hitler is successful in Europe, if Japan takes over China, then generations of missionary work is going to be put into doubt, that it's possible that it's going to be completely shut down. And so for them, they recognized that working with the United States to win the war was the best way to guarantee the future success of their ministries. And so they were patriotic, they were nationalistic, but it was because World War II was this unique moment in which the goals of the American state and the goals of missionary agencies almost perfectly aligned. I mean, they were working together for the survival of, what they saw as freedom of religion and democracy. And that was a big deal for them. I think historians have too often glossed over the importance of Roosevelt identifying freedom of worship as one of the 4 freedoms. But for these missionary activists, they really believed that freedom of worship was going to be the key to the post-war world. And so even though they would have to sacrifice during the war to ensure a victory, they believed that the result was going to be more access to more mission fields after the war.
And as Americans, they certainly didn't have the same guarantees abroad. What sort of troubles did they run into maybe before they joined the United States Army or before they thought of fighting? Were there any pacifists? Did they try to work with the local governments?
Yeah, it's a great question. None of my folks were pacifists. They all sort of recognized that evil, and they were both, I had more fundamentalist leaning folks as well as more liberal social gospel oriented, but they all recognized sort of the prevalence of evil in the world, and they were all very practical, pragmatic. So I guess I should answer the question differently. There were missionaries who were pacifists who didn't serve in the OSS, who rejected offers to work as spies. And some of them because they didn't want to shed blood, some of them because they didn't want to lie and deceive, some of them just because they felt like they couldn't have divided loyalties. But the ones whose stories I tell, the ones who did get involved in this clandestine intelligence work, they were the ones who had fewer moral qualms, although every single one of them regretted their wartime actions, but they felt they were necessary.
So they regretted this. Well, what sort of roles, could you perhaps describe the sort of things that they were asked to do? Because, espionage can range from, like you said, lying and deceit to, to murder, I suppose.
Yeah, no, and it did for these characters. So there were a lot of missionaries who were working in the research and analysis branch for the OSS back in Washington, D.C. and New York. I wasn't interested in them. I mean, they were performing an important service. They were using their backgrounds to help American intelligence, but they weren't putting their lives on the line. But the guys who I focus on, and they were all guys, they were all men, they were the ones who were out in the field. And so part of it really varied from person to person, but I opened the book with the story of this guy, William Eddy, who's my favorite character in the book. And he was planning, he was instrumental to Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. And as the Allies are preparing for that, he puts together a proposal that makes its way all the way up to the highest reaches of the Roosevelt administration, in which he proposes assassinating all members of this armistice commission from Germany and Italy at the moment the landing takes place. And then he goes on and says, I have a list of other agents, Axis agents in the area, and we want to kill them all. And he's gone and hired a French hitman to do the job, to essentially make sure that he doesn't get pinned for it and that the U.S. can claim to have nothing to do with it. And so I've got all these government documents and where he's explaining this plan, he's seeking approval, he's explaining how he's hired the hitman, who's going to do the work. At the same time, he's writing letters home to his family, to his wife, and he has 4 kids. And he's talking about Lent and the sacrifices he's making for Lent and how he's going to drink less and he's not going to go to the movies and he's trying not to smoke. And it was just, that's what drew me into this story, was this paradox of these people who are still very devoted to their Christian faith. And they're one person in front of their families, but then they're another person working for the OSS trying to kill their enemies.
And it's fascinating. And when Eddy is there and sort of drawing up these plans for assassinations, what is he doing on the ground in North Africa? What is his day-to-day sort of thing?
Yeah, so he was officially there as an attaché, so that was his cover, was a naval attaché, because he'd been in the Marines in World War I, and so he had a military appointment. But then the reason that William Donovan, the director of the OSS, who Roosevelt had appointed, the reason they sent Eddy to North Africa was they knew that he could partner with the local Muslim populations in North Africa and convince them, they hoped, to align with the Allies, so that when the invasion took place, the local Muslim tribes would support the Allies rather than support the Axis leaders. And this was a precarious situation because much of North Africa had been colonized by the French and some by the British. And so local Muslims weren't exactly eager to help out the French or the British. And so Eddy's job was to work with them and convince them that their best future lie with the Allies.
And you mentioned there, hopefully we can come back to Eddy, but you mentioned William Donovan, who's an important person. And what is his background with religion and with the military?
Sure. So he was an extremely successful soldier in World War I. He was a hero. He earned a number of decorations. And then he was an attorney by training. In the 1920s, he was very active in politics, served in the Attorney General's office, and then wanted to run for governor of New York when Roosevelt decided to run for president. He was actually staunchly opposed to Roosevelt, but Roosevelt, by the late 1930s, recognized that as the nation was debating whether or not to get involved in the war, that the more bipartisan he could make his foreign policy team, the better it would be for him. And he also decided to form this new intelligence agency, which had never been done before in American history. And so choosing Donovan was smart because Donovan was a well-connected Republican leader who was a corporate attorney who had been a soldier during World War I. And so he became a natural choice for Roosevelt to build this new secret organization.
And did Donovan have connections to these missionaries who were abroad, or would they sort of fall into his lap and kind of send letters of suggestion, or did his aides find? How does Donovan meet these people?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So Donovan was Catholic, and so he did have some connections with the Catholic Church. He had a couple of audiences with the Pope, and so he was interested in working with Catholics, and I tell that story in the book as well, like the Catholic agents that the OSS recruited. But the overall use of missionaries was something they just stumbled upon. It wasn't something they had planned or they had coordinated. And the way it began was really with Allen Dulles, who would go on to become the director of the CIA in the 1950s. But Dulles was Donovan's right-hand man. And Dulles came from a famous Presbyterian family, and his brother John Foster Dulles was an extremely active Presbyterian layman. And so Allen, even though Allen is usually considered the less religious of the brothers, and in terms of his own life, he was less religious, he understood the power of religion. And so he's the one who began recruiting missionary executives. And the first and most important one he recruited was this guy, Stephen Penrose, who becomes another major character in the book. And Penrose had been working in New York City for the Near East College Association, which was this umbrella agency that oversaw Christian schools around the Middle East and Turkey. It's like the American University in Beirut, the American University in Cairo, Roberts College. And so because Stephen Penrose was overseeing these missionary schools, he was the one who knew who was on the ground in other parts of the world and could work for the OSS. And so it was actually Penrose working with Allen Dulles who first proposed recruiting missionaries for espionage and intelligence work.
And you can see how this story you introduced as an international one quickly becomes tangled up on all these webs of connection. Did people like Penrose and Eddy and Donovan, they also had relationships with their churches and, like you said, with the universities abroad, with other perhaps non-governmental organizations. Did that create conflict between the government and their own sort of goals? How did those interactions work, and how did you the second part of the question is sort of like, how did you not continue down rabbit holes each time you get into these stories?
Yeah. So there were conflicts, and the way that it worked was, during World War II, if you needed transportation, you basically had to work with the U.S. government, or if you needed to get supplies abroad, you needed to work with the government. There was such a restriction on what you could do because everything was geared towards winning the war. And so Penrose and Dulles recognized that missionary agencies, either they needed to get people out of harm's way, or they needed to return missionaries to the field who had been stranded because of the war, or they needed to get supplies out to their missionaries, or in some cases to their missionary hospitals or missionary orphanages in kind of remote parts of the world. And so what Penrose would do is he would approach missionary leaders, missionary boards, and say, if you need any help with anything, let me know. I have an in with the government and I can help you get what you need where you need it. And so he was basically dangling this bait for the missionary executives. They would then write him back. And so I got all of his correspondence back and forth. They would write him back and say, oh, we would love your help. And then at that point, Penrose would spring the trap and basically say, well, we can get, a bunch of your missionaries back, but in return, we need 2 or 3 or 4 of them to do intelligence work for us. So that's how it developed. And the fun thing about this research for me was, there was a lot of fun things, but I could see all of this correspondence, all this back and forth from materials in the National Archives. But then I would try to trace them in the missionary organization's own papers. So, for example, the Presbyterian Historical Society, the Presbyterians worked very closely with the OSS. And I know who among the Presbyterian leaders was working with the OSS. I've got the guy's name, and his papers are in the Presbyterian Historical Society. But he had purged his papers of any interaction with the OSS. I think he recognized at the end of the war that this was problematic and that this might come back to haunt them. And I found that to be the case with the Christian Missionary Alliance as well, and a couple of other denominations, that people who normally kept carbon copies of all of their incoming and outgoing mail, they destroyed on their ends. They destroyed all of the mail coming and going from the OSS. They wanted to cover up this story.
Wow. And so you really had to go to both places to kind of read between the stories, I suppose.
Yeah, and that's the story of the whole book is with all of the characters. And part of why I chose the characters I did is they all had extensive paper trails in terms of their personal lives. And then they had extensive paper trails in the National Archives with their operational stuff. And so what I could do is, even though their letters to their families or their girlfriends or their children didn't talk about what they were doing operationally, everything's dated. And so I could see when one person would, write home and say, "You won't hear from me for a few weeks. I'm going out into the field." And then I could juxtapose that with the government documents and see what exactly it was they were doing. Or if they wrote their family and said, "I've been feeling tired and overwhelmed lately," then I could see what had been going on that was causing them to do this. And so the story of the book is putting together this puzzle with all these different sources spread all over the country to get this composite picture of this whole story of who these people were and what they were doing.
Very cool. And one of the things I think about when I think of missionaries is that, especially in the late 19th century, early 20th century, is that they're abroad often with their entire family. And you mentioned before that your biographical sketches focus on men. Where are the women in this story?
Yeah, and I should clarify, there were a couple of women missionaries that the OSS did use, and so I include them when I had the sources to tell the story. And one of the surprising, I guess it's not surprising, one of the limitations of the OSS is it was very much a white elite male organization. And so if they had used more people of color, I think they would have been more effective. And if they had used more women, they would have been more effective. But that wasn't how they thought.
Mm-hmm.
So there were some women missionaries who were recruited by the S. There just weren't many of them. But in terms of the family, of the four major characters, two are married, and their wives and families were mostly home. And so I have their correspondence back and forth. One was single and dated a couple of different women, and we have some of his letters, which are really fun to see, just in terms of how he's wrestling with the moral ambiguities of the war, and also trying to have this relationship in a war zone. Because in his case, he was dating women working for the Red Cross, and so they were in China also in the middle of the war. And then the fourth one, this guy Stewart Herman, his letters actually are not in an archive. His children have them, his sons, and they let me come and copy them all on their dining room table. But he was dating this woman during the war, and so he's writing her regularly about what's going on, and then he ends up marrying her right at the end of the war. And so you kind of see their courtship unfold while he's working as a spy, as an intelligence agent.
And you talk about the moral ambiguity. I'm sure there's a lot of areas where that comes up, but one I'm sort of interested in is how did these people interact with the sort of indigenous groups? Like, I imagine having been in North Africa, William Eddy had created at least relationships with a lot of the local population, and some that he might have to bear relatively bad news for. How did they interact with these groups that were already there?
Yeah, they were almost always advocates for the local populations, for the people they had worked with before. And so for Eddy, he's a staunch anti-colonialist, and he's really fighting and hoping that North African Arabs and Muslims are going to have independence and freedom after the war. And he's constantly asking Donovan to arm them, to provide them with money, to do everything they can to support them. John Birch was staunchly pro-Chinese, but that also made him staunchly anti-Japanese. And so some of his letters and ideas are extraordinarily racist in terms of their hatred for the Japanese, but it was out of compassion for the Chinese and what was happening during the war. The other interesting thing, because in Penrose, because of his work with the Near East College Association, he was staunchly pro-Arab, and so he was also anti-Zionist. And that became an interesting issue because one of his agents, kind of sub-agents, was a Jewish rabbi who was not a Zionist, but was on the ground in Palestine. And so we can see Penrose kind of having to work out this strange, uncomfortable relationship, at least it was for Penrose, because he doesn't want the Zionist movement to succeed. He doesn't want Jews returning to Palestine, but he's also needing to partner with Zionist organizations because they have great access to intelligence and great access to agents around Eastern and Central Europe.
And so in this advocacy, they kind of become like these sort of spiritual warriors that are maybe even more passionate about the cause than regular military. How were their interactions with the U.S. military? Did people kind of see them as these zany, strange people?
Yeah, not so much. They and it varied again from person to person. Birch had a great relationship with the U.S. Army and then U.S. Army intelligence and then the OSS in China because they had recruited him on the ground. He was there as a missionary, not as a soldier, but he enlisted in the Army and went to work for them. Eddy, because he had been a decorated World War I vet, he had a great relationship with the military brass, and he actually personally advised Eisenhower before the Operation Torch. And but Stephen Penrose, who was a civilian, he had a little more trouble, and there was clearly a difference between those who were civilians and those who were not. And then Stewart Herman, my guy in London, he had been the pastor of the American church in Berlin up until the war. He was interned when the U.S. went to war against Germany and then was exchanged. He, it was interesting for him. It wasn't a great relationship with the military, but he apparently didn't make a big issue out of the fact that he was a minister, a preacher, an evangelist, because at one point near the end of the war, when Alan Dulles has a new job for him, Alan Dulles writes the military leaders in London and says, I need Stewart Herman to do this work with these preachers. And they say, you must be talking about somebody else. We have Stewart Herman, who's running the Central European Operations Desk, but we don't know any Stewart Herman preacher. And it was the same guy. I mean, it was Stewart Herman, but they just didn't realize in his former life he had been a preacher. And he was actually, he was still preaching on Sundays. He would do guest sermons around London, but I guess that was just not something that he advertised at work.
And did these sort of feelings they had, especially with Herman, who was in Germany, how did they sort of deal with the existing government? Because they must have had a relationship with the government of the home country that they were once in. Obviously, it's probably very different from country to country, especially Birch with the Japanese invasion. How did they sort of deal with the existing government, the non-U.S. government?
So yeah, again, it is, as in all of these cases, it varies from person to person. With Herman, he got to Berlin in 1935, and he left an amazing paper trail. He would write these 5 or 6 or 7 page letters home to his parents every week, and he kept a daily diary and wrote a single page every single day of his life. And that was another source that I got from his sons just sitting across our dining room table, that no historian's ever seen this before. And so we can watch him in real time as he's trying to make sense as a young American, as a theology student, and then a pastor in this small church that's filled with expatriates. But we can see him responding to the rise of Hitler and Nazism. And at first he's curious about Hitler, and he's sympathetic in the sense that he thinks Hitler is doing some good things for Germany and that Germany got a raw deal at the end of World War I. And then over time, we can see him growing more and more leery and more concerned about Hitler. But it takes him a while to really recognize what a danger Hitler is. But obviously by late 1939, when the war breaks out in Europe, then it's clear at that point that Hitler's a real problem. For William Eddy, one of the interesting things about him is he ends up leaving the OSS in 1944 because Roosevelt appoints him the ambassador to Saudi Arabia. And he develops an excellent relationship with King Abdulaziz ibn Saud. And so he's a constant advocate for the Saudi regime and for trying to convince American policymakers that Saudi Arabia is an emerging superpower, not a superpower, but an emerging power that the Americans need to really ally with and take very, very seriously.
So these leaders are very significant in their location in a lot of ways, at least for their understanding of language and culture. What are some of the other tools that they're able to use that makes them such a valuable part of the OSS?
Yeah, and that's a great question, because this is exactly what the OSS leaders stumbled upon but didn't really think about ahead of time. So they had great language skills. They had great geography skills. They sort of understood the lay of the land. They had spent time abroad. They also were masters at infiltrating other cultures. They could blend in. So John Birch spoke numerous local dialects, and he could dress like a Chinese peasant. And even though he was not in any way, shape, or form Chinese, if he was, there were reports that he could essentially blend in.
Mm-hmm.
William Eddy didn't blend in as well in terms of the Arab world, but he understood the Quran inside and out. He had, in the 1920s, he would go out on the street corner and chant passages from the Quran with local imams. And so he was just somebody who was trusted. And so I think that's the other thing the missionaries offered is they could both blend into local populations, but they could also earn the trust of local populations. And so if the U.S. government needed somebody to serve as a liaison, the missionaries were ideal folks. But the challenge with that, though, was sometimes the missionaries were put in difficult positions where the American government wanted them to tell local populations something, and they knew they were essentially lying, that the U.S. wasn't going to live up to its promises. So especially about issues of decolonization. And so Eddy in particular really wrestled with that because he really was so against British and French colonization of the Middle East and North Africa, and he wasn't convinced that the U.S. was really going to ensure freedom for those folks after the war.
And I think this is where this gets just absolutely fascinating, is where you have these people who are so sure. I mean, you have to be at least to a certain point sure if you're a missionary of kind of what you're preaching, but they're not over there to export sort of American ideology or colonialism, and that raises doubt. Does the doubt carry into other parts of their life, or is this something that's kind of compartmentalized? The doubt is, well, I'm just doubting about what the government's telling me to do, or do you see it kind of spreading out in these letters?
Yeah, you see, I mean, just with the horror of the war, you see there are questions about God and reality and sin and evil in the world. But most of them, because of the kind of people they were much more pragmatically minded. So they didn't spend a lot of time obsessing over that. John Birch, who was the fundamentalist, he goes through a spiritual crisis, and he articulates it in his letters that like he's just feeling like he can't feel God anymore, and that he's just doesn't know what to do. But the rest of them seem to take it in stride. The one thing though that they all do is express regret about the deception and the double dealing and the duplicity of their jobs. And Eddy says it most clearly near the end of his life in the 1960s, where he says, we deserve to go to hell when we die for what we did. And then he said, I don't know if any member of the OSS or the CIA can ever be honorable. And then he said, if I had it to do over again during World War II, would I do it? And then he goes on to say, yes, I would do it, but that doesn't help me sleep any better at night. Kind of, powerful, horrible thing, because, and that was another thing I try to really play up in the book, is like the real choices these folks were having to make in the hard position they were in. And I think with World War II, it was easier in the sense that the morality of the right and the wrong, the good and the bad is pretty clear. But even in the case of World War II, it was still a challenge for them, and then it would, I'm sure, get even more challenging in the 1950s and 60s with the CIA.
Yeah, and that's sort of an important thing that I think your book, which comes out next week or 2 weeks from now, is going to do, is sort of push us to reconsider how religion has been a tool of the U.S. government. What does the government think of after these missions? Does the OSS, which turns into the CIA, does it see now the power of religion?
It does, yeah. And that, I think, is a key point, is that many government leaders just didn't take religion all that seriously, and the war convinced them, and some did, but that the war really made clear that both for Americans, but also for America's enemies, that religion matters. And it's stuff I think we sort of take for granted now, but I think in the 1940s, there was still this sense that secularism was going to triumph, modernism was going to triumph, that religion was ephemeral and didn't really matter. And then the war develops the way it does, and it becomes increasingly clear that, while religion is far from the only thing, it certainly plays a role in how people are thinking and how people are acting. And so for government leaders, they wanted to maximize that. And some of them, like Roosevelt, I think, were true believers. I mean, Roosevelt was a devout Episcopalian, and I think when he talked about freedom of worship, he really meant it and he really believed it. There were others who were probably more opportunistic, who just saw religion as a tool that could be used to expand American power, and they were willing to do that.
And after World War II, certainly the missionary landscape changes, especially if you were a participant in war and anyone would suspect you of espionage. How are these guys viewed after the war? How did they view themselves? Did they keep on working as missionaries?
They did, yeah. So it varied from person to person. But so Eddy never goes back to official work as a missionary. He works with the Saudi government for a while as an American ambassador. Then he returns and helps found the CIA. He's instrumental in doing that. And then he goes to work for Aramco, the Arab American oil company. And he saw his work with Aramco as part of the social gospel, as essentially modernizing the Arab world. It's a little bit disingenuous, I think, because he was also getting very wealthy doing that. But he at least writes to his kids that this is part of the family's pioneer missionary legacy is bringing these kinds of improvements to the other parts of the world. Stephen Penrose also continues to work for the military, then the State Department, and then he gets fed up. Actually, and he and Eddy both leave at about the same time. They're furious as the U.S. begins to move towards recognition of Israel. And for them, because they were both staunch Arabists, they thought this was a disaster, and so they both leave government service at about that point. So for Eddy, it's to go into the oil business. But what Penrose does is he becomes the president of the American University in Beirut, which was the agency, the school that he had helped oversee before the war. And they really worked hard to sort of downplay his experience as an intelligence agent during the war. But nevertheless, I think some people were aware of it. And I was able to interview his daughter. And there was certainly a sense among the family that important American leaders recognized that Penrose was not just the president of an important university in the Middle East, but that he also had connections to the CIA. And Stewart Herman, his story was fascinating. He was the one who had been in Germany. The project that Alan Dulles hatched for him near the end of the war was for him to quit the OSS and go to work for the World Council of Churches as it was developing, which was based in Northern Europe and Western Europe. And I'm totally blanking out. I'm thinking it's Amsterdam, but I don't think it's Amsterdam. But anyway, what they do is they are very concerned about reconstruction in Germany. And so they want Stewart Herman to serve as the main person to help them kind of figure out which pastors in Germany they could trust, which ones they couldn't, who had been part of the anti-Nazi confessing church movement and which had not. And so Stewart Herman becomes a minister again, working for the World Council of Churches, but the whole time he's secretly reporting to the OSS and to Alan Dulles about what he's doing. And he's working with the U.S. government, but secretly. And then he eventually leaves government work and goes back to work as a missionary and a pastor and then a seminary professor.
And so one of the things we have to deal with here is memory. After any war, the soldiers are commemorated and victorious soldiers sort of like put up as examples. But in clandestine service, it seems to be different, especially if in the case of like Herman, you're going to be used again. Was there any sort of attempt to make these people sort of pillars of clandestine service? Were they well known within the CIA, or was it sort of you do your service and then you disappear?
Yeah, it was the latter. You do your service and you disappear, and that's how they wanted it. That's how their missionary agencies wanted it, and that's how the OSS leaders wanted it. And it struck me when I really realized this was in 1946 or 1947, William Donovan wrote a long essay for Life magazine. And what he was trying to do was defend his organization and also make the case for what becomes the CIA. And he goes through and he lists how all the folks who worked for the OSS were regular people just like you and me. And then he goes through all the categories, that they're labor leaders, they're doctors, they're lawyers, they're businessmen. The one thing he doesn't mention is missionaries. I think they were very clear and very explicit about not advertising the fact that they were using missionaries. And Stephen Penrose, when he was working with missionary boards, he talked about how the boards should not tell the rest of their constituency that they're working with the OSS, that the money they're getting from the U.S. government, they should pretend like essentially they're laundering money to get into these missionary agencies, but they figure out ways to do it creatively so that it's not clear that it's coming from the U.S. government. And the reason was exactly the reason you asked earlier. which is that if a few missionaries are secret agents, then how do foreign populations know that any missionary is not a secret agent? And so they'd lose their trust. And so I think as soon as the war was over, this was a story that everybody was happy to cover over. And it stayed mostly covered over until 2008. There was a huge release of classified information, formerly classified information from 2008 that was declassified. And so scholars have spent the last 10 years working through it, and that's where I found most of my material about these missionaries. But if you look at the pre-2008 files, it's always redacted. It never, you can look at the same documents before and after 2008, and you can see that they covered up every evidence that it was a missionary or religious activist or religious leader of any sort.
And I mean, that in itself is sort of amazing that it could remain secret for so long. I would imagine foreign governments would suspect that. Certainly, we see it in governments that are openly or have been had policies that are anti-religion, such as the People's Republic of China. How did that work leaving World War II? So your book is about World War II. How far do you take it?
Yeah, so the last chapter I take it up to the present, because what happens is the CIA adopts the OSS's practice of using missionaries, and it's harder to figure out what missionaries were doing operationally for the CIA because that stuff is all still classified. But what we know is that in 1976, when Congress created the Committee to Investigate Intelligence, the Church Committee, they discovered that at that time there were about 18 or 19 missionaries or priests on the CIA payroll. And this really outraged, especially Senator Mark Hatfield, who was an evangelical from Oregon. And so there was a real effort in the 70s to clamp down on the CIA and to force the CIA to stop using missionaries, because there had been missionaries who had been killed, who had been accused of being CIA agents, who may or may not have been. So that was when, and I tell this story in the last chapter, George Herbert Walker Bush becomes director of the CIA in 1976. And his first act is to say, we will have no relationships, paid or unpaid, with missionaries going forward. And he did that to get Hatfield off his case, because otherwise the Senate would have probably passed laws prohibiting the CIA from using missionaries. So that seemed to settle the issue. And then in 1996, CIA Director John Deutsch testified before Congress and acknowledged that, in fact, the CIA has always maintained that they could waive the anti-missionary policy, that they could hire missionaries in exceptional circumstances. And of course, for the CIA, anything can be an exceptional circumstance. That got a little play at the time. And then most recently, so the last set of CIA rules and regulations was declassified in 2015, but was dated 2013. So the best we can do is what was the CIA doing in 2013? And at this point, the CIA still maintains the right to hire missionaries. The only stipulations they put on it is that they have to tell the missionary who they are, so they can't pretend that they're not the CIA. And if the missionary is not independent, if the missionary works for an agency, they also have to reveal themselves to the missionary agency. So they can't be cutting deals with Presbyterian missionaries and not tell the Presbyterian board or Baptist or whatever. So it troubles me that this guy refuses to stop using missionaries, because in World War II, it was necessary. There weren't enough Americans with the language skills, the geography skills, the culture skills to do the job. But I would think today the CIA could do without missionaries.
It's interesting, and that's certainly an interesting question too, because of the skills. And we've had the academics write about how a lot of our initial kind of knowledge came from missionaries and missionary families who would return, and often those missionary families were wealthy as well. But it's certainly changed a little bit. Do missionaries even still have access to all these places? If we think about conflict zones like Syria or Sudan.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think in a lot of places they don't, and there's obviously real restrictions on their freedom to proselytize in a lot of countries, especially in the Middle East. But what I've also seen, and again, it's hard to know, it's hard to document this stuff for sure, but every once in a while a story will pop up about, there was one about that there had been some missionaries who were very successful at sneaking Bibles into North Korea covertly. And so then the CIA realized, well, these people have a route into North Korea, we should partner with them to get whatever information the CIA wanted to get into North Korea. And so whether or not that was actually happening, I don't know. I mean, it was a story, I think it was in Mother Jones. But there are these rumors, these innuendos, these stories that pop up every once in a while where the CIA might be collaborating. And the other thing I should say, the CIA has never said that it would not use foreign religious leaders. And so the only issues have ever been with using Americans, but there's no doubt that the CIA is probably hiring religious leaders, religious activists, priests, evangelists, perhaps Muslim leaders in other countries to do work for them, to do intelligence work.
And often when we think about sides that are successful in war or factions that win, it comes down to good intelligence and strong intelligence work. And it's not necessarily something that I think most foreign policy experts would agree that the U.S. has done so well. If we put it on sort of reverse, and I know this is outside of the scope of your book, but do you see this as a sort of reverse possibility, other countries using religious leaders?
Yeah, and actually it's in the scope of the book a little bit that there was some evidence during World War II that the Germans were trying to recruit religious leaders, and the Russians were certainly using Russian Orthodox priests. So everybody was trying to do this. I don't think anybody did it as effectively as the Americans, but it's hard to know. I mean, the British could well have been doing it. I don't know if anybody's asked that question of the British intelligence agencies or not. I didn't find anything in the kind of the big books on British intelligence in the war, but it's clear that the U.S.'s enemies were doing what they could as well to make religion a tool of war and to use religious leaders for information.
Now, Basic Books is a publisher that is going to get a lot of eyes on this book. What is your hope for this book? I know you've written some very successful academic books, and you said at the beginning of the podcast you really wanted to aim big with this one. What are you hoping to see?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm hoping it does well. I'm hoping that it crosses over and reaches a general audience. Working with Basic has been fun. They do things differently than a university press. So one of the things they've done is they've made advanced copies available to people who are highly rated on Amazon as reviewers, like just how you just get your stars from your Amazon reviewers. And so there's already 10 reviews up on Amazon of people who have read the book, none of whom are academics, all of whom really like the book. And that's really exciting and really helpful for me to see, is that I have an audience among professional scholars, but it's breaking into the audience of people who just read war stories or read espionage books or are interested in missionaries. That's what I would like to do, and we'll just see if I pulled it off or not.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it has all the tools to do it. I think for sure the espionage angle is fascinating, but the religious history, and sort of religious reception perhaps better than most. What do you think the Presbyterian groups or groups that you're writing about will think, Catholic groups will think about this book?
That was something that I think was a little bit easier on this book than my previous couple books, because the previous books dealt so much more directly with more controversial political issues, gay rights, racism, gender, women's equality, that it was inevitable that I was going to alienate some religious constituencies. This book, it's pretty black and white in terms of the morals. I mean, the Americans are mostly the good guys during World War II. Not that all of their actions were good, not that everything they were trying to do was good, but they were fighting for a just and righteous cause. And so my hope and expectation is that the Christian audiences who read it, they might be a little uncomfortable with missionaries doing clandestine work, but that ultimately I think they're going to be happy to see what their people contributed to the war effort in a way that hasn't been acknowledged before. And I've already, this month's issue of Christianity Today, which is the leading evangelical magazine, they ran a really nice 3 or 4 page review of the book, and it was super positive. So it's already looking like at least among evangelicals, it's going to get a good reception.
Well, that's fantastic, and you your expertise is in American religious history. You explained how this is branching out a little further. Have you been drawn into these sort of global transnational stories? Are you going to return to this kind of thing in the future, or do you find that you want to go back and look at more American religious history?
Well, I've agreed to do a book for Basic that I'm excited about, a big history of American Christianity, just from colonial times to the present, to sort of explain why Christianity has had such a powerful hold on American culture, and certainly it will take into account um, global influence and global reach, but from the perspective of how the U.S. and the kind of bizarre relationship the U.S. has with Christianity has shaped so much of the rest of the world. But while I'm doing that book, I'm hoping to find another set of stories like this. I really enjoyed being able to immerse myself in these guys' lives and to figure out what they were excited about, what they were interested in, what made them tick. And, and I was rooting for most of them in the book. And that's what I'm hoping my readers will do as well, is they want these folks to succeed. And sometimes they do bad stuff. Sometimes they're not as sensitive as they should be to what's happening around them. But ultimately, they were all willing to risk their lives, and and one of them actually ends up does die to do what they wanted to do.
Yeah, and I think it's a kind of inspiring message. Hopefully people who listen to it get it, that you sort of mentioned, documents are constantly becoming declassified, and these people that seemingly no one knew about are being uncovered by historians. So it's always nice to see new stories, because that's one of the sort of common complaints from the outside of people who don't read too much history. Say, well, don't we know it all? But there's these amazing new stories and amazing new resources popping up all the time.
Yeah, and it's sort of, there's two things going on. One is that I had access to material that hasn't been accessed before because of declassification and because of pursuing these families. But the other part of it too is just asking different questions, and that historians for too long haven't thought about the way in which American religion influences American foreign policy. And I'm, there have been, for about 10 years, we've been asking that question, but there's a lot of material in the archives that wasn't classified, that's just been laying almost hidden in plain sight. And so that's the other thing this book does, is reveal stories that even if people didn't have access to all the information I had, there was probably enough out there they could have had some idea of what was happening. But I just connected all the dots because I was asking those kinds of questions.
Yeah, and that's fantastic advice for historians. It's all about asking questions and doing the research. That's great. So I will ask you a question then that we get to at the end of the Hour of History. If you can suggest anything to all the Hour of History podcast listeners, what would you like to suggest?
Yeah, I don't know. We covered most of the book. No, I think I think for me it's just how fun, I guess it's not really a suggestion, but for me, this has been how fun history is, and to think about, ethical questions I have and that I worry about in my own life, and, think about what kinds of sacrifices would I make for a country at war? What would I do, with my family, with my wife and my kids? And so history allows me to kind of work those issues out through other people's lives. And as I mentioned, I didn't always agree with my characters and what they were doing, but it was an important exercise for me, I think, to think about how I see the world and how I relate to other people.
It is an interesting question, and something that I think history does so beautifully is helps people kind of consider some of these tough questions. And I'm sure the people who check out Double Crossed are going to ask these questions of themselves and be totally immersed in this story that it is by all accounts fascinating, and hopefully they can make it into some movies there, just like they did with Mo Berg, another OSS story.
Yeah, and we're actually there's possibility of that happening. We're in some communications now, so we'll.
Very cool.
But it would, I think.
Yeah,
Hollywood. There are few projects that actually get made that people are early on interested in, but there's definitely been some early interest. So we'll see what happens.
Absolutely, and yeah, you read these stories and you can kind of just see the action unfolding, and it is very good. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we sign off here?
No, I really appreciate it. This has been fun.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Matt Sutton. His book is Double Cross: The Missionaries Who Spied for the United States During the Second World War. And it's a fantastic book coming to bookstores everywhere near you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Stephen.
On Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place. Thanks for listening.
Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to check out our recommendations page at hourofhistory.com/recs. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. There you'll find links to the books mentioned during the podcast, and if you choose to purchase one, you'll be supporting the podcast in the process. And if you still haven't gotten your fill of the Hour of History, make sure you head over to the Hour of History blog, found at hourofhistory.com/blog, with articles being released fairly often on topics relating to those covered in the podcast as well as others. With that, we conclude this episode and hope to have you back for the next one. Take care, and again, thanks for listening to the Hour of History podcast.